Our third and final presentation for today is from Dr. Amanda Howard and from Dr. Margot Rawsthorne from the University of Sydney, who'll be presenting on community-led disaster resilience, learning from the Get Ready community pilot project in New South Wales. Now make sure to please use the Q&A function. If you have any questions, we'll have 5 minutes at the end of the presentation where we'll be asking Steve some of the top questions that have come through based on your voting. Okay, so thank you. Over to you, Amanda and Margot.
Thanks very much, Marie. I'm wanting to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live and are meeting today, and particularly for their care of country and the knowledge that they have so willingly shared with us about how to care for this country as we're going forward. It's been really interesting listening to the two previous presentations and to be thinking through where our work sits in that in this broad field of disaster work. In terms of how this work that we're going to talk about today, Amanda and I are going to talk about today, relates to particularly the Helping Hands work at Lismore. We've been working at the preparedness stage of disaster. Having said that, the communities in which the pilots took place are not free from disaster. So they all experience disasters in various ways. So one of the things I think that we might want to be starting to think about is this whole notion of different stages of disaster and whether or not we need to be rethinking that staged way in which planning and policy and practice is happening. Before that, I just wanted to acknowledge that this project has many people have contributed to it. There is a research team made up of academics from University of Newcastle and University of Sydney, but we've worked with a very large number of people on the project. There's a New South Wales project reference group who have provided great support and insight into practice on the ground for us. Sarah and Mandy from OEM, that are, it's now Resilience New South Wales. The team from the Foundation for Rural, Regional and Regional Renewal. Sorry, FRRR. We just use FRRR as the acronym. Particularly Natalie, Emma and Janet, who we worked really closely with in the earlier stages of this project. And the communities of North Richmond, Wee Waa and Ocean Shores. They were the pilot communities that put up their hands and participated in this project. Those relationships are ongoing and are very valuable to the research outcomes that we've been able to identify so far. Also, whilst we've worked with particular members of the communities in those places, we've had great support from emergency management staff and volunteers more generally, local government, councillors and workers from local community organisations. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, it's been a partnership approach. Probably the key partnerships have been with FRRR, OEM and the academics at the two universities. But we've also had involvement from RFS, SES, Fire and Rescue, Department of Primary Industries and Australian Red Cross. So I think that kind of what I'm trying to, I suppose, why I'm wanting to emphasise that partnership is that this kind of whole of community, whole of government approach is really essential to preparedness. Next slide, please. Okay, so this presentation is based on research that's been undertaken in 3 communities. Interesting communities in that they face different challenges and have different strengths. So a rural and remote community of Weewar, a peri-urban community of North Richmond, and a coastal community of Ocean Shores. The way that the research has rolled out has been informed by an action research design. So the researchers have been engaged in the process with local community people and the project officers from FRRR in a ongoing dialogue around what are we doing, what are we learning, let's test some new ideas, let's evaluate how those new strategies have actually rolled out. So if you could put it onto the next one for me, Andrew, thanks. Okay, so this is a pretty poor representation of action research, because it suggests that there's this nice clear lineal approach when in fact you'll see shortly the chaos that goes on. And I'm sure you know, absolutely you know the chaos that goes on in communities, that we don't start in one spot and finish in the other. But what we're trying to demonstrate here is that it's about investigating what's going on, then gathering knowledge, and then measuring capabilities, etc., doing some interventions, and then trying to gather as much understanding of the different processes and the dynamics within communities in order to better support communities with the preparedness stage of well, there we go, I thought we used that term, stage, for preparedness in terms of disaster. And the next one, please, Andrew. Okay, so the project, it's very hard when you think about an action research project or a community engagement project such as the one that FRRR was rolling out, to think of a beginning and an end. Whilst it's in theory a 2-year project, it started well before the 2 years, and it's still going. So, but in terms of just making some logical starts and finishes for the research, it was a 2-year project. It involved some early initial community engagement, followed up by some workshops and community conversations, support for communities to develop their ideas. And Amanda's going to talk shortly about a range of ideas that came out of communities. So you won't be surprised that we had a diverse range of community ideas and projects that came forward. People in Weewar had a very different idea to what people in Ocean Shores might want to do. And our role as researchers was to support OEM and FRRR to work out what was it in common between those, what looked like on the surface quite different projects, and to try and articulate and tease out what are the common things that underpin community engagement and around preparing for disasters. It meant that we spent quite a bit of time in communities, we being the action research team, with FRRR on the ground, having conversations, constantly looping around, trying to work out the best way in which to help and support communities to act in this space. Okay, So if we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to hand over to Amanda now to talk about my commentary there about, we were trying to look at what the different communities had in common in their efforts to prepare for disaster. And these are some of the big ideas that we identified. So there you go, Amanda.
Thanks, Margot. So as part of this research project, one of the things that we were really interested in is what are those kinds of whether they're characteristics or processes or features in communities, or what are those themes which actually support resilience building in the long term. So we did quite an extensive literature review. We looked across all the research in Australia and elsewhere overseas around, what we know about what builds resilience at a local kind of level. And we came up with these kind of focus areas, or we call them kind of pillars, which really support this kind of work carrying on in a community-led kind of way. And these things are communication, networks, self-organising systems, decision-making, information, resources, tools and support, and inclusion. So these are the kind of things. This is not, we could probably have quite a long argument about other people's kind of ideas about, oh, I want you to include this too, or I think this is more important, or that's not more important. But across all the literature, these were the kinds of things that actually kept coming up over and over again as key kind of areas around resilience building. So these are the things that we paid close attention to throughout the 2-year process. These are the things that we were really interested in finding out about, and that we spoke with communities and emergency service providers and community organisations and government about. So this next picture, you'll have no chance of actually seeing at all. But when you get the slides, you can take it home, and at home you can blow it up and see how this kind of picture, you'll make more sense of this picture. I'm just going to tell you a story about this one. I've got 2 more to just tell you a quick story about, to give you an idea about how we tried to understand about these different pillars. This is kind of a mind map, but it's based on an idea called ripple mapping. And in ripple mapping, what you do is actually you work really closely with the people who you're working with in the community or in the group, whoever you're working with, and you actually map very detailed processes about what happens, what that leads to, where you find dead ends, where you might take a process to a certain point and it stops, where a process starts to actually gain momentum and it actually might take a few different directions, or it goes in one different strong direction. In this picture here, we're talking about self-organising systems, and this story is a story about the Street Connect group, which is one of the local community kind of action projects that came out of this project, and it's still going. It's really going from strength to strength now. This ripple map tells a story about how this particular small group of community people utilised their informal networks, connected with people they knew in the area, used those kind of networks to then try and find more people to actually start exploring how they could actually work in terms of building really local street by street neighbourhood connectedness and disaster resilience. This particular group, through lots of different conversations in the community, came to the idea that they wanted children to be leaders in disaster resilience. So it connects really well with our first kind of presentation. And they started to work on how would we actually support children to be leaders around a disaster resilience building. So in this map, somebody in the group knew a principal who was their neighbour. They had a chat to them. Other people went through more formal kind of processes and talked to the school cluster of principals. And different conversations actually then led to a few different kind of outcomes. In one outcome, there was a community workshop at a local primary school, and that was a time to bring children and other community members together. But that one kind of went that far and then stopped because a key person in that process, who was the principal at that time, was seconded off to do something else. So this kind of mapping enables us to say, okay, this went really well until a key person left. So that was a really a hindrance to that process going on. In another kind of aspect of that, another school was engaged, and people talked the principal, and the synergy kind of formed around the school was interested in videos. they had a studio. The kids actually wanted to make a video. They then wanted to come on board. They scripted a video. They made the video. They then leveraged an ex-student from the school who was who was in the film industry, who came and gave his time for the day with the kids, and they made a video about being connected and how that actually helps you be safe from disasters. Now that video was then presented at the school assembly, so it had a really big reach. And then finally, well, not finally, because it's now on YouTube and you can go and see it, that video was shown at a really big community event, the Carols event in North Richmond, as all the fires were burning all around at that time just before Christmas, and the kids got up and actually showed their video and actually were able to have a really big impact on the crowd in terms of making those connections. So this map shows you a really complex process about how you get from a group starting and wondering what they're going to do through to coming up with these kind of great outcomes around children as leaders in the local community. That's not the end of that story. There's a whole lot of other stories that are coming off from that, but that kind of tell you, this kind of mapping enables us to see not just, oh, we did this project and then there was this outcome, but these are all of the complex processes that are involved, the relationships, the communication, how the networks work, you know, how resources are used around that kind of stuff. Can we have the next slide, please? I'm a bit aware of my time. This one I'm just going to talk about very quickly as well. This is a picture about the resources and support kind of part of the pillars of supporting this team, and it's around the concept of trust. And what we found was this is a really massively important part of building community-led disaster resilience in all of the communities that we were able to walk alongside with. So this tells you a story, again, about this same group and how they actually built trust with each other, with broader community, and how they started to actually get connect with a whole lot of different people in the community, start to co-design ideas, which we've just talked about, one of those ideas that they started to do. And then they wanted to engage with the emergency services. And they started to say, how do we actually then connect with emergency services at an official kind of level? They'd already had relationships with and communication with local kind of volunteers and local staff who they knew, but they thought we want to do this in a more formal kind of way. Through those kind of communication processes, they got an invitation to the local LEMC, the Local Emergency Management Committee, to give a 10-minute presentation. They were really hopeful that this was going to really connect them with the formal emergency services sector, and how the community sector and the emergency services could actually work together. Unfortunately, what they actually came across is actually a really common thing in emergency management generally, and Ellie talked about it as well, is that the imperatives which are driving formalised emergency response and emergency management and imperatives which are driving community are quite different. And what they actually experienced when they went to the LEMC is that the LEMC adopted, instead of going, oh, this is great, how do we work with you? They adopted a very hierarchical approach and actually saw the community as something to be suspicious of, something that needed to be controlled. What are you up to? What are you doing? Why aren't you need to do what we say? And so there was this whole question around the community being seen as needing to be controlled and do what they were told rather than taking the initiative. Now, what the result of that was that the Street Connect group came out of that meeting feeling disempowered, feeling like they were not trusted, and there was a lack of trust that was actually then built. They then made a decision to carry on with their work apart from the LMC, which was a missed opportunity for that to happen. The LMC then didn't follow up around that stuff. Now, I'm not telling you this story because I want to demonise the LMC. What I'm telling you the story is because it really, again, this mapping points to the details of where things go wrong and where the work is that we need to do around connecting formalised emergency services work with community processes. Okay, we might just go to the next, not the next slide, but the one after, because I think we're going to run out of time. So anyway, those maps give you a bit of a sense of the kind of processes that we went through. We were trying to really understand the detail of how these things work in communities, how it works over time, and what actually creates fertile ground for building trust, building relationships, and actually building resilience, and then what hinders that, and actually just what puts a big gate up and actually shuts it down. And we actually have that's a few of the many maps that we have about all the processes, and it gives you a bit of a sense of us trying to understand how do we then support this kind of work to carry on. We're just going to very quickly talk to you about our key findings, and I'm going to hand back to Margot to do that.
Thanks, Amanda. As I said, there is not a sense at which there's a start and an end to this work. It needs to be ongoing work. But what have we learnt so far in terms of how do we support communities be more prepared for disasters? And when I say communities, I think one of the things that we've really focused on, and I think is a very important thing from what other people have said in the other sessions today, is community in its broadest sense. We're talking about including young people, talking about including the Aboriginal community, we're talking about including people with disabilities, older people. So it needs to be community-wide in its broadest sense. What we would argue from our work so far is that this will work best when it's community-led, that the community itself is put at the centre of disaster planning. When I say that too, I'm not saying that that is exclusive of emergency services, emergency management services. They're obviously community members as well, really important community members. What's the challenge is working out how those different elements of the community can work well together. It's about trying to understand or create processes that enable communities, the various parts of the communities, to be equal collaborators, that it's about shared responsibility. Now, rather than the rhetoric of shared responsibility, making it real in terms of planning and decision making. So shared responsibility is not being called in to the formal processes at the last minute, it's actually being there at the beginning. Any sort of community development, and Ellie mentioned this, any sort of community development requires sustained investment of time, energy and resources. It's not cheap, it's not quick, but without it, you're not going to have resilient communities are able to manage the numerous kind of climate-related disasters that, or the more regular climate-related disasters that are coming our way. The big challenge that we're seeing in our work, and this is not, we're not breaking any new ground here, but we're seeing it on the ground, is the difficulty of the crisis and command kind of framework and control framework, and how that sits in an environment where people need to be much more agile and adaptive. If you have the next one, we could go back to Amanda for that next one if you like. No? Is it me?
No, I can do it. I'm sorry, I was just looking for the link for people. I was trying to find the link for people so that they could actually see the video. But that's okay, I can do that a bit later on. So I guess the other kind of 3 big points I think that we want to make around this stuff is that resilience building information and communication has to be multi-way in design. What we actually found was that often communities were seen to be people who were passive recipients of information. You're expected to receive information and do what you're told, rather than actually be engaging in actually co-designing that information and communication. Being in a dialogue, being actually in that kind of conversation in the long term, it's really essential for this work to happen. Community time, knowledge and skills and effort is often not recognised. It's quite invisible in communities, but it's an enormous resource, but it also needs to be recognised as an enormous strength. And, and Ellie kind of gave a fantastic example of exactly how that works in a crisis. And I guess finally, what resilience is it's not something that, again, that communities need to be resilient. It's something you just need to do yourself, but it's actually this array of structures, of processes, of relationships and networks, which all support the community to be strong. It's not just for community people to do it on their own, but you need this whole array of activity to go on around that stuff. In terms of just where to from here, and you can just quickly go into that next one. In terms of where to from here, I guess, there's work to be done around redesigning resilience building processes so that the communities and emergency services can work in a different way together. There needs to be attention given to ongoing resilience building. We found that generalised resilience builds disaster resilience. It just doesn't have to be disaster resilience, but it certainly lends itself to that. Dialogue and relationship are key. There's some cultural change work to do, and training around community engagement, around community connectedness. And this work needs to be invested in. It actually needs to be, it doesn't happen on its own. It needs to be invested in with resources and also with good decision-making and governance. That's about it from us. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Amanda and Margot. And I think certainly that mapping activity just highlighted the complexity of the relationships and networks and the multi-way kind of nature of such relationships and how important they are. Look, we have run out of time, so unfortunately we won't have time for any questions. Amanda, Bridget did post the link to the video in the chat function, so yeah, it's all good. So look, a big thank you once again to Amanda and Margot and to all of the presenters across this session this afternoon. That was the last presentation in the session.